as I read further, it stops sounding like a researcher, starts sounding like a movie character, became fluent in Mandarin Chinese and moved to Tibet.
The kind of cordyceps, everything it does in that TV show, and it does it to caterpillars, and it gives them a compulsion to climb to a very high place, and then it kills them, and then a mushroom grows out of their head, and the spores spread and infect more caterpillars. A statistician will tell you that machine learning is statistics with a glossy scene painted on the side. I think a lot of people who come into data science often feel frustrated with just the amount of things that they feel like they're supposed to know. I wanted to provide people with a programming library that they can use to solve a variety of causal inference problems.
You've got graduate degree from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, PhD in mathematical statistics from Purdue. And when you have too much free time, you run this little website called altdeep.ai, where you're a founder and instructor, and people can learn a bunch of things about machine learning. How much free time do you have now?
I try to make more space for it now. I had a son about 2 years ago, and he needs a lot of free time these days, so I have to be a bit more intentional than I used to be.
Oh, congratulations.
Thanks.
But then, as I read further, it stops sounding like a researcher, starts sounding like a movie character, or maybe specifically anime character, became fluent in Mandarin Chinese and moved to Tibet. Why?
I wanted to do a PhD in economics, and I had been really influenced by the works of economist Amartya Sen, who does developmental economics, Nobel Prize winner. And so I wanted to do some field work in the developmental economics space prior to pursuing a graduate degree, and ended up trying to do some work with some agencies in Tibet. The idea there was trying to sustainably grow. The word in Chinese is 虫草. In English, it's like a medical name. It's eluding me, but you know that video game and TV show, The Last of Us?
Yeah.
It's a show about zombies that are caused by this fungus that infects humans and then takes over their heads and makes them go after other humans. And this is a real thing. It exists. It's called, cordyceps. 虫草 is a kind of cordyceps. Everything it does in that TV show, in that video game, but to caterpillars. Also to other insects, but it does it to caterpillars, and it gives them a compulsion to climb to a very high place, and then it kills them, and then a mushroom grows out of their head, and the spores spread and infect more caterpillars. But this mushroom is a very valuable substance in the area of traditional Chinese medicine. And so if you go into an Asian grocer in the States and you go to some of the health food section, you'll see cordyceps. And you'll be shocked for the prices that it goes for. And so this only grows in the Tibetan plains. And because of the value of this fungus, there's a lot of economic incentive to just overproduce it. And so this particular project that I was involved with is looking at how to sustainably produce it. But during the process, I found myself much more interested in the numbers than in the logistics and the day-to-day of field work. So I ended up pivoting towards statistics and then came back into my degree in stats.
So
Unclimatic ending to a story about a zombie fungus.
Yeah, I was hoping the fungus made you do it. And then you somehow found yourself transitioning to machine learning, right? Quite a lot.
I think a statistician will tell you that machine learning is statistics with a glossy scene painted on the side, right? And specifically, I was interested in, I think this is when I was in the beginning of my PhD, I think the second age of neural networks was just taking off. So I was interested in graphical approaches to analysis. And I was working in the neural net space, but I remember early on I wanted to work on a natural science because I wanted to do something that was a bit more anchored in some kind of real physical laws, something where there was some kind of physical ground truth that you could use as a gold standard. Mm-hmm. And so I got into systems biology. My advisor at the time, who I chose, her name is Olga Vitek. She's also at Northeastern. But I wasn't so interested in her particular area, which was, and it still is for the most part, statistical proteomics. I was more interested in her as an advisor and as a mentor. So I ended up working with her. And then so given her background in statistical methods applied to biology, she pointed me in the direction of systems biology. So systems biology is the study of the complex systems that underlie organisms, particularly at a molecular level, and interactions between proteins, between genes, between metabolites, etc. And these are often using graphical representations. And I became really interested in this space. And this is how I got introduced to causality, because there were people who were using causal graphs to map out these complex systems. So it was stats in the sense that I was working with data. It was using machine learning algorithms, particularly from the space of graphical models. And it was using graphs, and it was using causality. And so I think that was where all these things came together for the first time.
So we should get a counter of the number of times we say causality in this conversation. So it's currently at 2, I think. Is that what you also teach at Altitude.ai?
That's the most popular workshop that we have on causal machine learning, which is, as you mentioned, I have a book coming out, and that workshop was the motivation, or I guess the source material for the book. So I think the causal stuff typically is the biggest draw, for sure.
That's probably not a coincidence that if someone goes and Googles your name, there's going to be a lot of causality and causal AI stuff coming up.
I don't personally see that as my brand as a researcher, but your brand as a researcher is not entirely up to you. I just finished a paper with some really, Eric Horvitz, who's the CSO of Microsoft, a few other doctors and a few other researchers on the use of large language models in the context of medical question and answering. And to me, these are related in the sense that when I came to causality, I was already pretty much a full-on kind of Bayesian statistician. That was the way I saw the world as an analyst. And as a Bayesian statistician, you're thinking about, okay, what are my beliefs about this data generating process? What are my goals in terms of objective functions or cost functions, reward functions that I need to optimize? How am I going to model uncertainty in this space? And causality just became to me an extension of that, in the sense that I have certain causal assumptions about the data generating process that I want to include in my modeling. And similarly, this kind of recent work with multimodal models, I think of it like, okay, here's this foundation model, which is a kind of, I think of it as a large knowledge base, if you will, of assumptions across various domains that I can extract a shape through the prompt, maybe shape further with a bit of fine tuning, and use to address problems within a specific domain with the help of domain experts. And I don't think that's a universal view of how one approaches multimodal models, but it's strongly informed by my experience with Bayesian stats as well as with Causal AI. And so to me, these things all connect in my head, but I think from the outside, they feel like, on these things that I'm working on, I feel like completely disparate areas. And if I could be a bit vulnerable for a second, I think as a researcher, one thing I could be doing better is telling a better story for how all of these pieces connect. But it's just never been my nature to do that. We mentioned China earlier. Chinese government is known for having these 5-year plans and 10-year plans and 20-year plans. And I'm not a 5-year plan kind of guy. I just have my view of the world, and I have things that I'm interested in, and I go after them. And so that's how I end up working on, say, for example, that Economist article, which is about disinformation and generative AI in elections, which does not feel at all connected to causal AI. But it is for me.
So your upcoming book of the same title, Causal AI, Manning publisher, expected sometime early next year. I think you've basically finished writing all the chapters, and now it's just polishing and actually getting it out, right?
Yeah, I think we're just doing copywriting now and checking that I use colons instead of semicolons when I'm supposed to, that kind of thing.
Dotting the I's. It takes a little bit of time. It's not a research book, right? It's a practical book. I think you described it as code first, and we can talk about that aspect a little bit. Who is it for?
Practically speaking, it's for data scientists who are trying to understand how to do causal data science without having to deep dive into a bunch of disparate theory. What do I mean by that? Causal inference is a field developed across different disciplines, including, say, for example, economics, econometrics, public health, and applied social sciences in general. as well as statistics and computer science. And you end up, when you kind of encounter this space, you find people using different language, different values in terms of what's important in research, right? So if, for example, you are a public health researcher who's trying to figure out whether or not, say, just these are trivial examples, smoking causes lung cancer, right? Either it does or it doesn't, and there you're trying to get at some kind of ground truth, because that ground truth is going to influence policy. Let's suppose, on the other hand, you're an AI researcher and you're trying to write an algorithm that emulates how humans reason, deploy causal reasoning in some kind of context. So like a human walks into a room and sees a broken glass with liquid spilled on the floor, and they see the angle of the glass broken on the floor, and they see a small child or a dog looking shameful in the corner. And so what they're doing is reversing this movie of events in their head and then playing out different scenarios, assigning likelihoods to each scenario, and asking themselves what would have happened had the dog not been here, what would have happened had the kid not been here. These are all kind of counterfactual questions. If you're trying to write an algorithm that emulates this thing, you're not so much interested in the risk of a false positive. If you come out and say, like, this medicine fixes this disease, this vaccine prevents this illness, and you're wrong, the cost of a false positive is really high. But if you're trying to emulate how a human is reasoning about this scene, and you're trying to use that to build a robot, your cost function in terms of errors and false positives, false negatives is a little bit different, right? And I think as a data scientist coming into this field, and you're just hearing all of these voices often saying different things that are not aligned or in conflict, it can be a bit daunting. As well as when you look at the algorithms themselves, oftentimes you buy a book on causal inference and they read like essentially cookbooks of different statistical inference algorithms for causality. So an example of these might be like using propensity scores. One other one might be using instrumental variables. And the math is different, the language is different, and you're just like, okay, do I just have to memorize all this stuff? I think a lot of people who come into data science often feel frustrated with just the amount of things that they feel like they're supposed to know. So one of the things that I was trying to get across with this book was to say, listen, let's focus on some kind of tools that can do a broad area of inference. Let's say, for example, use PyTorch. So I focus a lot on PyTorch in the book. In PyTorch, there is lots of ways to solve an inference problem. So generally speaking, there's a lot of ways to solve an inference problem. You can say, for example, use linear algebra. You can use a solver. In PyTorch, you have to, or in any kind of deep learning library, you have to specify some differentiable cost function. As long as you can optimize that function with respect to your problem, you're golden, right? And I wanted to provide people with a programming library that they can use to solve a variety of causal inference problems. And still, even if they walk away feeling like, I feel good, maybe I could have understood a little bit more, but at least you've learned how to use a bunch of PyTorch, right? So that's a very useful skill, regardless, as opposed to learning some algorithm and then you're not really sure when to use it or how, and then maybe in a couple of months you forget it. And that was one of the goals there, or one of the audiences I was trying to hit. I think the other one would be people who want to build these things. A very well-known researcher in the space, perhaps the most well-known, is Yuda Perl, a Turing Award winner, and for his work in graphical models and eventually causal inference. And he has a book, a popular science book called The Book of Why. And in that book, he talks about what causal AI might look like. I think the one that comes to mind is an example of a robot housekeeper that wakes you up in the morning with vacuuming, and then you're upset at it, and it needs to figure out why you're upset. And so for people who are looking at that part of those, he doesn't really dive into that stuff particularly that deeply in the book. He focuses on the bread and butter stuff in causal inference. But for people who were interested in, well, that sounds cool. What does that actually look like? Can we talk more about that? I think this book is for them as well. And yeah, and I'd say lastly, another important group I would say is people who have to manage the first two groups. So I really wrote with the idea that, particularly in chapter 1 and then at the beginnings of each chapter, that anybody who was not going to implement this code, not going to implement these methods, but needed to understand if they were actually valuable to the business problems that they were trying to solve, could get that from this book. And I'm not sure how much that is going to land, because it is a Manning book, which are technical, they're code books. But I do hope that somebody could scan those first introductory sections in each thing and say, yes, my people need this. That comes from my experience in running All Deep and working with a lot of teams at companies. And there you have to talk to the team lead and help them understand how it solves their problems. Once they understand, then people tend to line up behind them. And so I use a lot of, for example, in my experience, a lot of causal inference books, they look at a lot of problems from econometrics and from public health, because that's where a lot of this field developed. I focused on problems that you might see in a corporate setting. So, for example, there's a video game example that I use a lot in the book about trying to figure out which set of users to your video game platform are more likely to pay for virtual items in a virtual world, for example. I use another example from a streaming platform like Netflix, where you're looking at some set of users who you're afraid of losing them to a competitor because they just bought a whole bunch of content that competes with your content. Specifically, I use an example of spy thriller content. So let's imagine you're a streaming service, you have a bunch of users who like watching spy thrillers. Your competitor just bought James Bond, bought the 007 franchise, and you're worried about attrition. And you ask a bunch of counterfactual questions like, okay, if we had done this deal with this showrunner for this new spy series, what would have been the effect on attrition, that kind of thing. So yeah, particularly from tech and retail, those types of problems, I think you'll see come to the surface more in this book than in others.
That makes sense. I've got to say that when you said the broken glass example, my mind went in a very macabre kind of scenario. So I'm glad that it ended up with a dog or a child stealing glass. I also like the example you gave, I guess maybe because it's a little bit more practical and sounds a little bit more magical, about the robot butler that figures out why you might be upset at them, right? That feels very human. We do a lot of this kind of inference very often on very fuzzy data, and sometimes we're quite good at it, right? Where are we right now between what you said, recommending figuring out the churn in your show and figuring out how to do a robot butler that can pick up why we're upset?
Within the field of causal inference, those methods are there. So that robot butler case gets into an area of causal inference that I would call, say, responsibility or attribution. Some people might say root cause analysis. Some people might say actual causality. And we want to be able to generate explanations for why something happened. And it's an interesting field because it leverages the core concepts of causal inference and counterfactual reasoning, but it also has to borrow from other fields. A kind of trivial example would be like, let's suppose that I were smoking in the woods during the dry season and then a fire were caused. And, you can look at two causes. One would be the fact that I was there smoking, and then the other would be the fact that it was dry. Typically, a human would weight the fact that I was smoking as the bigger causal driver because of both norms or the likelihood of that event. So, for example, there is a dry season each year, and that's a thing with high probability. That's during certain seasons, it's going to be dry outside. It's not a surprise. On the other hand, smoking during the dry season is, in a normative sense, this is rare. In other words, that I should not be doing this. And so like those types of treatments of the probability of the prior causal event, or in terms of norms, how normal or abnormal the prior event is, these are things that we can use probability theory, we can use CogSci to kind of come at it. And yeah, so these things have been incorporated within these frameworks within causality to do things like assigning responsibility and blame. In the context of, say, for example, robotics, it becomes a matter of essentially scaling it up. So in the example I just gave, I said that I introduced two potential causes, the fact that I was there smoking and the fact that it was dry outside. So that's one problem. Somebody has to scope the problem, right? So the robot has to walk into the room or be exposed to the situation and decide what are the factors that need to be considered. And the other thing that needs to happen is, given those things that need to be considered, the robot needs to figure out whether or not these were abnormal or normal prior causal events, or whether or not they were likely or unlikely or probable, improbable prior causal events. So they need to be able to do that as well. And then I think finally, things need to be scaled, right? So you need to be able to, for example, connect this to a robot with sensors walking into a room and perceiving the environment, deciding what are the variables of interest and what it's going to ignore, decide how they relate to each other. And so there's computational difficulties there as well, which are problems that we see all the time in computer vision and robotics. And so we need to unite those things together with some of these more fundamental ideas.
And in your example, when you say norms, do you mean like a human being has basically seen a million times no smoking here, no smoking there, and made connections between there being a no smoking sign and maybe just being a petrol station that can blow up, or a number of other situations, and then brings that context to the analysis? Is that the kind of thing we're talking about here?
Sure. For your listeners who have a background in AI, they might know the term alignment, right? So alignment in AI is what we mean by how do we create AI that has values that align with human values. So a lot of times norms is another way of saying a value judgment. I'll give an example. So I'm from the United States. In the United States legal system, let's suppose that I were to enter a grocery store and I were to accidentally bump into a bottle of olive oil. It fell down onto the ground, broke, left a puddle, and then an elderly person didn't see it, slipped, and broke their hip. Would you judge me to be culpable in this case? Would you blame me for this? Honest question.
Sounds pretty subjective to me, right?
I would say it was an accident. I was just in the store buying some cereal, and this thing was sitting out on the edge of the shelf. I bumped into it. I didn't notice. It would be maybe the store's responsibility to make sure that they had a safe environment. And this is typically true. Like in this scenario in the U.S., most people wouldn't blame me. Now imagine same exact scenario, but now I break into the store at night with the intention of robbing the cash register. I accidentally bump into the olive oil. Again, and my goal wasn't to break any hips. My goal was to sneak in, get something valuable, and leave. And this was incidental to that intention. And now in that case, at least according to American law, I'm culpable for the injuries to the elderly lady because the circumstances under which the accident happened, despite the fact that it was an accident, the circumstances constituted a norm violation, right? So you can imagine how difficult this would be to just the intention has changed. You can think of it as night, as time of day, maybe the store was closed, but putting aside time of day, at the end of the day, it's about, was I going in there to buy some cereal or was I going in there to commit a crime? In the United States, any accidental injuries that happen to somebody during the commission of a crime, you're also culpable as the person who's committing those crimes. So those are what we call norm violations. And norm violation comes from particularly this area of causal inference literature focused on this problem, as well as places like cognitive science and legal theory. But in the AI setting, I would call this an alignment issue. And
also, one of my background threads in my head is currently trying to scour for examples. And I think that's probably why we differentiate between like manslaughter and actual murder, right? It's all about the intention. And then convincing the people that the intention was this and not that, based on the evidence.
So manslaughter and murder would be the primary outcome. So let's say I'm intending to commit murder. At the same time, while I'm fleeing, I accidentally
run over somebody.
Something completely accidental. So I accidentally destroy some property, like I'm fleeing and I hit something and nothing is broken. The police would charge me with criminal destruction of that property, as well as the primary crime of committing murder. So like in the context of doing a crime, any accidental thing that happens on the side gets lapped on. You're culpable for those things, even though they were an accident. But when you're not doing something abnormal, then they're considered just ordinary accidents and you're not blamed. And that's the thing that you can imagine how tricky that is to try to turn into an algorithm.
Yeah. So do you consider causal AI a breakthrough or just like an iterative evolution of the existing methods?
I would say that from this perspective of artificial intelligence or machine learning, anytime we can come up with a method or algorithm that can achieve capabilities that we were not able to achieve before, we would call that a breakthrough. And I would argue that indeed, in some cases, when we use a method from causal AI, we will achieve that. It's often difficult to figure out what are those specific cases where we're doing something that we couldn't do before in a reliable way, in a consistent way, in comparison to things that we can achieve usually by just scaling up more with more data or larger architectures. And I think that the reason it becomes difficult to differentiate those in that way is, I think for one, it's difficult to come up with benchmarks that are really evaluating these new abilities. But also, if we look at kind of methods in artificial intelligence or deep learning, for example, that just focus on scaling up with more data, more architecture, we often see evidence of things working, but it's hard to get guarantees or even in practice observations of these things working consistently. Say, for example, if you go into a model, say ChatGPT right now, and ask it to solve a problem, and you're like, look, I asked these types of questions, I posed this types of problem to a large language model, and it gets it right. Sometimes, maybe a lot, but sometimes it doesn't. And I have no way of predicting when it's going to get it wrong. I can't control this system in a way that I can get a guaranteed outcome. Sometimes it'll hallucinate, in other words, and so sometimes it'll say the wrong answer. If I could guarantee that it either gives me an answer or says, sorry, I don't have any way to guarantee a good answer in this case, that would be great, but we don't have that. And I think there's a lot of causal questions that are like that, where sometimes you would take this, sticking with the example of large language models, you would pose it some kind of set of causal queries, and it would get it right. And then when it got it wrong, it would look really right that if you aren't already an expert in the area, you wouldn't realize it.
Yeah.
And so I think that becomes a challenge, not just specifically to large language models, but in general in kind of causal AI. Sometimes a breakthrough looks like a breakthrough when actually it's doing it sometimes, but sometimes it's completely not working and we don't know when. And causal methods help resolve that to some extent. But then it becomes difficult to figure out when we've hit a breakthrough or when the breakthrough already happened and we're just trying to assign some guarantees or make the thing more robust.
So are there any next thresholds that you expect if the field manages to hit this particular threshold or solve this particular issue that would make it so much more useful? Is there the next blocker for it to becoming more than it currently is? Other than obviously what you just described, which is like a kind of built-in frustration working with things like large language models and stuff like that. What would you say would be other, blockers?
So we've talked a little bit about robots, and I'm interested in, and so are a lot of other researchers at MSR, in this idea of what we call embodied data. One of the main ideas in causal inference is interventions, right? That an agent is taking an action in the environment that they're working in that changes the data generating process. And that change, because you have a causal model, is predictable because you understand the physics of the system and how the change will affect the system. And this is how humans understand science, for example, right? We run experiments. We create a closed system, and then we apply a well-defined and controlled set of interventions to that system, and we see what happens. And then we try to explain what happens, and science evolves. And I think a next major milestone would be able to give this ability to intelligent agents. The robot doesn't just come into the room and see what's happening, but the robot can probe and can change things and try stuff and see how that affects the system. And then in so doing, it gathers data, and that ability to gather interventional data and learn from it, I think would be a bit of a sea change in the way our intelligence agents are able to reason about the world. If you think about even some of our best models now, say some of these, I mentioned ChatGPT, GPT-4, or these various large language models, multimodal models, oftentimes the data it's working with is passively collected. So the agent itself doesn't have the ability to go and say, pose hypotheses and then go and test those hypotheses. So I think once we get to a point where we're able to develop those types of systems and develop proof of concept there, then we'll see some major advances. That's a prediction.
I like that prediction. I can already see clickbaity articles where people use ChatGPT to write things like detective jobs at risk. Robots can now go and test things and make assumptions and collect their own evidence. From the point of view of your book, I just want to go back to it a little bit and give people a flavor of what it actually looks like. So as I was reading through that, there's a lot of DAGs, a lot of, directional acyclic graphs that you work with there. You connect it to deep learning as well, and also LLMs. Can you give us a quick review of why everybody should go to mining.com right now, look for Causal AI, and get your book?
Causal inference is an essential part of data science, right? Like typically in data science, the questions that we're trying to answer are causal, right? If I'm doing an A/B test at a company, I'm literally trying to answer which has a stronger effect, causal effect on this KPI, on sales, for example, on clicks, right? Is it A or is it B, right? And so just having that basic grammar and to thinking about those problems, using code in a code-first book, and that's connecting across a different set of problems and a different set of algorithms, but all based on the same core ingredients, things like directed acyclic graphs, things like interventions, like we just mentioned. This book will give you that grammar. It'll do so using some very useful libraries, including PyTorch, right? So that you're able to see the same things that people are using to fit fancy deep learning architectures. You can still use those exact same optimization algorithms to solve these problems as well. Who are interested in building some of the applications we just talked about, foundation models that can reason causally, agents who are able to pose hypotheses and test them by intervening in the world. This book is the only book out there that will give you the language and the code to do that. And so specifically with those two examples, like chapters 12 and 13, for example, chapter 12 covers causal modeling in the area of decision-making and reinforcement learning, right? So there you're getting deep into robot country, right? And then chapter 13 has some practical examples using large language models. There's also links to all the code in a GitHub repo online that they're running in Jupyter notebooks. So you can just go there and run those and then copy those notebooks and adapt them to your problem or to your data sets. And I'm also posting extra bonus material that's not in the book to that repo as well. So for example, working on a tutorial for doing semantic editing. So this is like when you go into DALL-E or Midjourney, and if you're familiar with this idea called infill, where you generate an image with generative AI and you highlight some area and then say, this image is great, but I want this place to change, right? Take a causal perspective to that. Say, this image is great, but what would it look like if this stuff were changed? And using a causal model to affect those. And it ends up doing things that infill doesn't do as well. And so there's a lot of that type of bonus content that we're adding to the website as well.
Awesome. So like I said 3 times already, mining.com is where you find the book. It's currently still in the early access, which means you can read it online while you're waiting for your copy.
Yeah, to my understanding, like the version of it online currently is very close to what the final version will be. There's no more adding or changing of content. There's no more adding and changing of code. Right now, we're just going through a copywriting process, generating the index, all of the last bits. And so if you bought the book now, you'd be getting more or less the same thing that the final version will look like.
How do you like writing specifically a mining book? It's a little special. They've got their way of doing things.
I was joking with some friends, like, this is a lot of work. Next time I'm writing, like, vampire, werewolf, teen romance triangle fiction. That's
a weirdly specific example.
It's just like the amount of work that goes in versus the payoff is a lot more. You do things like, you just write this chapter and it's looking great, and then somebody updates the library and then all the code breaks. So you go back and you have to either update the libraries or you have to point them to specific versions. And even that, anybody who works with Python knows that even just being explicit about the versions doesn't guarantee you that everything is going to work perfectly, things like that. When you're trying to write code for a book that goes into a print, there's a whole bunch of kind of formatting constraints that are there. It's more than just like writing good, clean code. You have to write a bit of code that doesn't take over more than 2/3 of the page. You want to write clear variable names, but at the same time, they can't be too long because then they'll go to the lines will be too long. It's a lot of that kind of stuff, which is no fun as a writer. Just basically all of the stuff that goes into having code that is readable and works for a book as well as for a digital version. You can imagine these deep learning libraries, they use a lot of boilerplate, don't they? And even just those, you download some code from Hugging Face and then you have a data loader. And it's just a bunch of stuff that applies a bunch of transforms to your data before you run your training. But it's just a lot of boilerplate. And they're like, okay, I got to fit this onto an A4 page without having it take over the entire page and still have text. That wasn't any fun, but it's behind me now. So if you're listening, I hope when you look at the code, you just appreciate all of the backflows that have to be done in order to get it into that perfect format.
Fortunately, we have a built-in filter, and over the time, we remember more the good things than the bad things. So there's that. I wanted to do a full circle and go back to what you said earlier, that you don't necessarily want to be Mr. Causal AI. So what should we expect to hear from you, and how should we follow your work?
So the way I think about my work is that I'm fundamentally, like I mentioned before, I take a very Bayesian approach to how I think about problems. And what I mean by that is that I believe that you as the analyst, you come to a problem, you're trying to understand a data generating process, and you want to model it. And the best way to do that is to take your expert assumptions about this process and use it to constrain the model, use it to inform the inductive biases in your model. When I say inductive bias, so this well-known result from philosophy as well as machine learning is that induction problem. In other words, where there's not a single solution given the inputs. You need some kind of inductive bias to steer the solution in the right direction. And I believe that inductive bias shouldn't be some opaque technical elements of the model, some kind of weird constants that you see being multiplied on the outputs of activation functions in deep learning, but they should come from you as the expert who's working in this space and has been intimate with the data and has real goals that they're trying to achieve. All of that should be factoring into the modeling process. And I think that what I'll do in the future is continue to look for ways of making it easy for people to do that. Say, for example, causality is one of them in the sense that you mentioned DAGs. DAGs are a really great way of capturing your assumptions about a problem. It's easier to write a DAG about your problem than it is to write, say, a Bayesian prior. Oh, this has a prior of a Gaussian with mean this and standard deviation. That's very hand-wavy, but if I said this causes that, it's a lot more intuitive. And similarly, saying that this causes that in a way that's monotonic. It always either, when this increases, that's either increasing or decreasing. Those kinds of assumptions, how can you bake those in? So generally speaking, I think the ability as a modeler to be able to approach a problem like that and have it work for you within a specific context, that's important to me. So I think if I look a lot at these days at large language models, and I think to myself, okay, let's imagine that these models are going to get, what does that mean for me as an expert? Can I have my multimodal model reflect my values, reflect my knowledge about the world, right? Particularly now that it's smaller, is there a way I can create some kind of fine-tuning process? I think those are the types of problems that I'm excited about working on, and that will drive the largest impact.
I'll definitely try to follow that. Robert, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Please do let me know when I can order that RoboBattler.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks for reaching out.